episode of the MPP series. MPP is essentially also known as a Master's in Public Policy, which is a master's degree. Please note that towards the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session for which I will request all of you to put in your questions in the live chat, which would appear on the right side of your screen. Today, we have with us Shimal Kapoor, who graduated from NLS Bangalore in 2016. She was also a recipient of the prestigious Lamb Fellowship in 2017. And then she also served as a Judicial Law Clerk, after which she also completed an MPP from Harvard Kennedy School in 2020. In this session, Shimal will be sharing her story about securing an MPP from Harvard Kennedy School and take her through her experience in pursuing the same. I would now like to hand it over to Shimal to begin the session. Shimal, over to you.
Thanks, Abhishek, and thanks, Tarun and the IT team for putting this together. So I think that before we go into the Harvard experience, I think it's important to understand where somebody who might want to apply to HKS comes from. And for those of you who don't know, HKS refers to Harvard Kennedy School. So I think for me, my story, especially as someone who wanted to pivot into policy from law, started back in fourth year of law school when I was sitting for placements. And back then, this is, it was pretty standard that you only went into legal careers. Policy was not really a thing. And of course, I'm speaking about 2014, 2015, but it was still not a very popular career choice for lawyers back then. And even your established think tanks were just setting up at that time. And a lot of lawyers were just beginning to go into the policy side of things. So when I was sitting for placements, I realized that none of the jobs that were there on offer excited me. While I make no judgment whatsoever about the choices that other people made to go there, to me, it was just not exciting to either go into pure litigation or to go into a law firm or just end up teaching the law or studying law further by way of an LLM or a PhD. And it became increasingly clear to me that this was not the space that I wanted to be in. So I was extremely passionate about the law, but I really wanted to drive change from within. And as someone who came from a non-legal family, who didn't really have a background in politics, it was very tough to find a way to access that kind of opportunity. So I'd heard about PRS for a really long time, which is the organization that organizes the Lamb Fellowship. And I had also heard about the Lamb Fellowship through a few friends and through a few peers. And it was something that I'd been keeping track of a really long time. In fact, I had been keeping track of PRS as an organization since 2011. So I saw the call for Lamb Fellowships, and I think it's typically 2 months before the deadline. I reached out to a few people who I knew had done the fellowship, and they had fairly positive things to say. And what sold me on the Lamb Fellowship was just this idea of accessing a member of parliament in such an intimate way, because you get to interact with them almost on a daily basis. You get to actually frame policy positions with them, and you get to be a pretty big support in a pretty big role that the member of parliament plays. And I think that it's a pretty good starting point for anybody who wants to be introduced to the world of policy and may not have a very strong handle on what it is exactly they want to do. So I applied for the Lamb Fellowship, and as luck would have it, I made it. And I ended up working with Mr. Baijayant Panda, who was a very active member of parliament. And I was very fortunate to actually end up working with a member of parliament who was so active in parliament. So just through him, I got the opportunity to assist him in so many of his functions as an MP and as a public figure. So for example, I used to help him draft speeches. I used to help him draft op-eds. I used to help him draft his parliamentary interventions. And of course, it was always a dynamic, organic process in the sense that there would be a lot of exchange of ideas. And eventually, I would feel like I had contributed in my small way to nation building, so to speak. So while I was doing the Lamb Fellowship, I ended up meeting a lot of people in the policy space. And it wasn't just people in think tanks, but it was also people like civil servants. It was also people who were academicians and trying to do studies via academic centers. There was actually a lot of activity in the policy space, and I just think that I didn't know about it. And the more time I spent there, the more it looked attractive to me. However, there was one thing that I really wanted. There was this one itch that I really wanted to scratch, which was doing a clerkship in either the Supreme Court or the High Court. And the reason that I think that this goal was not mutually exclusive or divorced from my desire to be in policy was because I felt that the Supreme Court especially plays a pretty significant role in policy making in India. And I really wanted to understand how the Supreme Court thinks, what is the scope of their powers, what is the rationale that judges undertake when they try to do policy making from their judicial positions, and essentially just understand the interplay between the legislature, executive, and judiciary. Through the LAMP, I had understood how the legislature and executive interact. I think what was lacking for me was an understanding of the judiciary, and that's what prompted me to go into doing a clerkship. And I was lucky enough to clerk with Justice Chelameswar, who, as many of you may know, held a very notorious press conference. But for me, the highlight was not the press conference. For me, the highlight was actually actively working with somebody who was in a position of such great responsibility towards the country. And right off the bat, I ended up working on the right to privacy judgment, and that actually solidified me that policy is the space I want to be in and not law, because I realized that for a judgment like the Puttaswamy judgment to be given effect, you needed policy making, and you needed good policy making. Now, what do we refer to when we're thinking about policy making? It's not just about writing academic papers. It's also constant engagement with government, of stakeholders, of interest groups, of governments themselves with each other. And more importantly, it's also about trying to enunciate a set of principles that in abstract we might know to be good, but in practice may not always be practicable or efficacious or necessarily achieving the ends of the policy itself. And during the course of my clerkship, I realized that what I wanted to do was study further and build some skills that I didn't think I had. Now, if I know anything about legal education in India, it's this, that it's not a very holistic sort of education, in the sense that we do study some degree of arts or science or commerce, and we study the law primarily. We don't really pick up any interdisciplinary skills, at least as part of our core curriculum. For example, one of the big things in policy making, right? Data, and the other statistics. These are not things that we're taught to understand in law school. And I would say that it's a pretty lonely endeavor to try and pick those things up while you're there. In fact, when I came into policy making, I was deeply uncomfortable with numbers. I hadn't touched a math textbook for 5-6 years, and I had, very little comfort with calculating things or understanding the implications of numbers. And in my mind, I don't think I could have been an effective policymaker or contributor to policymaking without learning those essential skills. So that's when I started shopping around for what course to apply to. And while an LLM was an option, just because of the fact that I definitely knew I wanted to study further, I realized that it won't give me the skills that I want. I didn't want to do an MBA because I didn't want to end up acquiring only a business-like perspective on things. And so I landed on policy. Now, we'll go into this later about the distinctions between masters in public policy and public administration, etc. But it became pretty clear to me that a master's in public policy was the kind of curriculum that would actually meet those needs, where it would help me grow and acquire skills that I didn't have, but at the same time also keep me in touch with the field that I had newly entered into. So when I was trying to narrow down between schools and geographies, I ended up picking the US overwhelmingly, even in spite of the costs and all the other considerations that come with applying to the US, just because it was the only country that I think had a consistent and a really old MPP program history, so to speak. And Harvard, in fact, had the oldest history when it came to masters in public policy. What drew me to the US specifically was also the fact that it was a very quant-heavy program in the US, and I feel like I needed to throw myself into the deep end. I didn't want to go and venture into what was comfortable because I felt that I wouldn't grow if I didn't try to push myself into a position of discomfort. And that's how I made the decision to apply to the US. And I didn't really consider any other geographies at that time. Harvard by itself is, of course, a self evident choice in some senses, but the primary reason I was very keen on going to HKS was because it was probably the most international program for this kind of study that you'd have, not just in curriculum, but also in student body. And it was also a dedicated school, a school dedicated towards public policy, and a pretty big body at that, and a very rich alumni network. So I, did my research, decided that this is where I want to go, and applied, and I got in, luckily. And that's how I ended up at HKS. It was, I will say that it was a world that I did not know existed before. If somebody asked me before I went to HKS what a randomized control trial was, I would, hem and haw and, bluster my way through it, as is the way of lawyers. But spending time at HKS, struggling through courses that had a pretty strong focus on quantitative data analytics, coding, tech electives that, ended up helping you nuance and specialize in a lot of areas in a wide variety of fields, and with a practitioner focus. That was, for me, one of the biggest draws as well. Not only did practitioners teach you, you were also taught how to become a better practitioner. And I think it's the practical skills that really make a difference when we're looking at an education. I think the popular conception, at least in India, is that you learn on the job. And especially as a lawyer, I think that, when you're in law school, it's a pretty theoretical engagement with the law. And the internships that we all do, the multiple internships that we do, is a way for us to keep engaging with the practical side of things. But I think you don't really realize what the skills you need to succeed in the practical side of things. You don't really pick those up in the theoretical side of things. And an MPP, as a former HKS alum who I ran into during my LAMP fellowship, actually described to me, he said it's an MBA for public policy people. And he was dead right about that, because you end up picking up a lot of skills. You do end up picking up operational skills as well. You do pick up finance skills. You pick up management skills. You pick up leadership, negotiation. There's a lot that you do, but I feel that it's a lot more concrete than what you end up doing, in an MBA, and a lot less academic than what you would do in an LLM. So that's what drew me to it. That's how I ended up there. And a lot of my choices, even while I was there, were dictated by this idea to pick up something that I hadn't done before. I will caveat it by saying that it was a deeply uncomfortable 2 years in some senses, because I constantly felt like I am a total newbie. I don't know enough about this. But it was good, because now when I talk about these things, I can talk with a lot more confidence. And I come from a place of having to learn things organically and grow from the get-go. And I think that's a very good, not just a very good exercise in becoming a better professional. I think that's also a character building exercise where you realize that it's not something to look down upon to want to learn new things. It's not something to look down upon if you don't know something. And I think that what I would say was the fundamental factor that has driven me in all my initiatives has been curiosity. I've always wanted to slake my curiosity, and I've tried to do that without any judgment towards myself. And I think that it was a very uncomfortable choice to make back then, when I was thinking about applying for masters in public policy in 2017, because I didn't know that many lawyers who'd done it. And even at HKS, I would say that lawyers who are not from the US are a rare minority in some senses. But I think that we're a pretty useful contribution to that class. And more importantly, I think that being a lawyer is always an advantage in policy making, because who better understands institutions than people who have to study institutions for 5 years? So that's my story. And I think, Abhishek, you might want to follow up with some questions on this. So over to you.
Thanks a lot for that, Shimal. I think that was very insightful in itself. But I think I would want to pick up from your very last comment that lawyers already do have a very good idea about public policy itself. So do you think that that gives any kind of an edge to a law student who's applying compared to a student coming from a different background when they're applying for an MPP?
Yeah. So I think that's a double-edged sort of sword to have, wearing the cap of a lawyer. Because a lot of times you might not feel like you have an advantage when you're in the program, because there's a lot of new skills that, trust me, none of us are schooled to have in law school. At least, when I was in law school between 2011 2016, we definitely weren't taught those skills. But when you're applying, you may not have an advantage when you're applying, but you do have an advantage in the sense that it's a pretty natural course to take for a lawyer. At least if you look at the story, right? And all successful applications are essentially about telling your story well and telling a good story. And it's been my experience, at least, especially when I've spoken to other lawyers who wanted to do this kind of work, that they are natural fits for policy just because of the fact that they understand all the underlying mechanisms that go into it. Like, and this is something that I don't know whether it's common across law schools, but one subject that I think is not given its due is administrative law, not always given its due in law schools, because we don't really understand the impact of it. But when you start pivoting into policy making, or when you start developing an interest there, you realize that it's actually that area of law that really governs this whole concept of policy making that we're speaking about. And it's extremely, extremely helpful to already have that understanding, because I noticed when I was doing my master's in public policy at HKS that there were some things that I just got that my engineer colleagues or my colleagues from programs like those at DU didn't really understand. And I think those are the nuances that end up setting you apart. And that being said, even the experience that you gain right out of law school is intrinsically related to the field. So I think in those senses, it is an advantage. It's not like lawyers pivoting into something like business, for example, because speak to any lawyer who's done an MBA and they'll tell you it's a hard transition, but it's not such a hard transition when it comes to policy. So I think it's an advantage for you as somebody who wants to be in the field, though it may not necessarily be an advantage when you're writing an application.
All right. I think that's a very interesting answer, but I think I would want to go back to the application process itself, if that's okay. And I would want to ask a couple of questions with respect to that. So I think the first and most obvious question that almost all students who are watching this video would definitely have is that what exactly are the eligibility or qualifications that are like a minimum threshold that are required to even apply for an MPP? And also, as a follow-up to that, is MPP something that anyone can just do after any bachelor's degree, even if it's not a bachelor's in law?
So this is, and again, I want to be very clear when I say this. This is with specific reference to HKS. But I do think that you don't need any, at least for an MPP, the only qualification you need is to have a university undergrad education. And that's just the requirement. But if anybody can do an MPP, at least at HKS. They do make a very committed effort to have a diverse class. So they do have a pretty healthy mix of not just lawyers, but engineers and people from, arts backgrounds and business backgrounds. And it's, I would say, pretty eclectic mix, because you end up seeing a lot of, and you may not see those people in your master's in public policy program necessarily, and you might see those in mid-careers, but you do see a lot of people from backgrounds that might seem totally unrelated, such as, for example, education, or even for that matter, something like climate change or human rights. And I would say that basically anybody can be a good candidate. And the difference is that if you're applying for a master's in public administration or an MPA ID, which is an MPA with a focus on international development, you do need to have a certain set of skills, a certain kind of background. So, for example, for the HKS MPA, when I was applying, you needed to have a master's degree or have a master's degree in progress in some specific fields to be able to apply for the master's in public administration. So what a lot of people do is, for example, they'll do joint degrees where they'll do an MPA at HKS and they'll maybe do an MBA, for example, at Wharton or any partner school. And I think the list of partner schools is pretty dynamic. That's one way to do it. Some people do a joint MPP at HKS and an MBA at HPS, and it's, I would say, a pretty varied class. So I would say that nothing is a disadvantage as long as you have shown that you have a commitment towards public service, and I can elaborate some more on what that means when we come to that question. But an MPP, at least, is the broadest age range, so to speak, at HKS. I had colleagues that were 22 years old and also 32 years old. So it's anywhere, in my opinion, between 22 to 32. Typically, people older than that may not want to apply for those programs just because they're already too skilled or overqualified for those programs.
So I think my next question again is just going to pick up from your discussion on the MPA, or the Masters of Public Administration, for those of you who don't know. So how exactly do you think the MPA is different from the MPP? And also, how do you think a student could actually think which one would be more suited for them?
So like I said, for an MPA, you need to already have a master's degree or have a master's degree in progress at the time that you're applying. But that apart, if you already meet those conditions, I think the fundamental thing that distinguishes an MPP from an MPA, aside from the eligibility requirements, is the core curriculum. The MPA program does not really have a core curriculum. The MPP is more of a foundational course in some senses. I think that it's a really good introduction to the policy world if you don't already have those skills. Not to generalize, I know some lawyers may have quantitative skills or coding skills already, and they might find that the program might be a little restrictive for them. But I do think it's more of a gentle nudge into the policy world, as opposed to being more self-directed in the MPA. Typically, the MPA class is also a little bit older, just given the eligibility requirements. But it's self-driven in the sense that there's nobody really hand-holding you through that in terms of what courses to take. You will have a lot of guidance, obviously, no matter what program you do at HKS, but you may not end up having a lot of guidance on what direction to take. The MPP that way is uniquely suited to people that don't know the world of policy making too well. And it has a lot of foundational courses in things like applied economics, applied statistics, negotiations, which I think lawyers already end up doing in law school, but it's a very different sort of focus because it's also giving you an introduction to things like basic communication skills, such as how to write a good policy memo or how to make a good policy debrief, things like that. The one thing I will say is that the MPP is a little more restrictive in the sense that because of the core curriculum, you already have some of your credits that are spent on those courses. But that's not to say that there isn't any learning there. It's just that you do end up losing out a little bit on electives. And the one thing that you have to do in an MPP that you don't have to do in an MPA is the HKS version of a capstone project where you work with a live client and you give them a deliverable at the end of your second year.
Okay, that's actually very interesting. So going back to the application process itself, could you tell us a little bit more about when you actually applied? What was the application process like? What were all the requirements? If there were any exams that you gave, and how did you prepare for them?
Sure. Just before I jump into that, I do want to say one more thing. I think the MPA ID is, this is a little controversial, but I think it's the flagship program for HKS in some senses. At least it was considered so. And I think that's also a relevant program to speak about because unlike the MPA, it doesn't require you to be on a master's track, but it is the kind of degree that will train you to have the same skills that somebody who would do. And of course, I mean, this is probably not an approximation of those skills, but similar skills to what someone who's done a PhD in economics would have. So a lot of people who do MPA IDs are very suited to international development roles, which means that they would end up in institutions like the World Bank or IADB or ADB, banks like those, because they are looking for people with those skill sets pretty often because they want someone who has operational deployment skills and operational management skills in addition to quantitative skills so that they can understand what exactly the scope of the work they're doing is. Just give me a second. I will come to the requirements right after I say this. So the MPA ID also has a more broader age range. You will have people between 25 to 40. And it's a pretty small class, but it's a good program for anybody who wants to end up in international development. Yes. Excuse me. Yeah. So speaking about what exams I took or what qualifications you need, what the process looks like. So back when I applied in 2017, we had to do two mandatory essays, which are called JFK essay and the MPP essay. And then we also had to do a personal history statement. And in addition to that, we had to answer a series of questions on the application itself. You also have letters of recommendation. You can upload up to 3. And back then, the GRE and the TOEFL were mandatory. Not mandatory, but you had to take either the GRE or the GMAT for most MPP schools, and you had to take the TOEFL or the IELTS if you're applying to the UK, I think. So I don't really know about the IELTS since I didn't really end up exploring that as an option. But I took all the exams that I had to because I didn't really have a lot of awareness about this back then. But TOEFL, for example, is an exam that you could request an exemption from, just because we're all taught in our medium of instruction is English in our universities, and you just need to make your case to whatever university you're applying to. And in this case, HKS is also pretty receptive to that particular concern. The GRE is optional this year, given the restrictions that COVID is placing on people's ability to take the GRE. But from what I am aware of, this year you also have to write 5 essays, not 3 essays. So in addition to the MPP essay, JFK essay, and personal history statement, you also have to write an essay on how you plan to give effect to what your idea of diversity is, and adversity, and also how you failed at some point in life and how you overcame that. So it's a pretty grueling process, I would say. The JFK and MPP essay try to get to know you as an individual, and the personal history statement is more to understand where you came from. So the JFK essay is a good way to understand your goals and understand overall how you contribute to JFK's motto, which is ask what you can do, which is also the HKS motto. It's essentially trying to understand how you would be somebody who can contribute to public service in whatever way, whatever capacity that you can. So it's not specific to contributing to public service in the US. It's really about contributing to public service in your sphere of influence, whatever that might be. And the MPP essay back then was a question of just how you could, balance your work ethics, your strengths, your capabilities, and interests to be a good member of the MPP class. So since Abhishek has hopped off, I'm just going to wait for him to rejoin. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where I left off. So I would say that there are multiple components to an application. There is obviously your own transcript. There is your letters of recommendation that you need to arrange for. There are the essays that you need to write. You also need to do your research on HKS as a school and the MPP program, because a lot of the questions that you fill out in the course of the application do probe how well you know the school. You do need your CV in place, and I believe that is the practice this year as well. You have to additionally upload what's called an analytic or a quantitative CV, which just details your engagement with whatever limited engagement you might have had with quantitative or analytical skills. And you, of course, have the essay answers. What I will say is that the GRE and TOEFL, especially if you're considering applying this year or next, are really exams that you can negotiate on taking. And I recommend not taking them if you can avoid it, just because I believe they don't really contribute a lot of value to your application. What really contributes value to your application is the components that I listed before. And the GRE and TOEFL are merely indicative of your ability to keep up with the quantitative requirements of the degree and the requirements of being able to speak English, because the only mode of instruction is English. So that's the bare bones of it. And I can go into more detail on different components, provided Abhishek has some follow-up.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So I think I do have a follow up with one very specific thing, which I think plays out in two different ways. So that is with respect to, and this is an interesting question that we got. Are there any specific kinds of internships that a student could do while at law school, which might be relating to public policy, that might actually help him or her actually even get an idea of public policy itself, and also maybe increase my chances of getting in, let's say at HKS or at any other college for an MPP? Or like, let's say, are there any other activities post law school?
So I think that, yeah, I understand the question. I think that, yes, a commitment to public service in that sense is a pretty vague sort of factor to assess anybody by. So I can just give some background about myself. When I was in law school, I experimented with all sorts of internships. I picked what was interesting to me, and not just internships, on-campus activities as well. I ended up doing a lot of things that was not strictly legal in that sense, law related. Let me put it like that. So, for instance, I did a lot of random activities on law school campus, on my law school campus, which pertain to things like making recommendations for legislative changes, interacting a lot with civil servants, interacting with people that weren't necessarily only in the legal field. But I think that the world of policy has changed so much that there are a lot more opportunities available right now. I mean, one thing that I did in my fifth year when I realized I wanted to go into policy was I ended up working at an NGO for around 2 months. And I got a pretty strong insight into how non-lawyers interact with policy. But I think that, yeah, like today there are a lot of internships that exist. There's, your typical think tanks like Vidhi, ORF, yeah, CSE, etc. Like depending on your interest area. I think that it's up to you to figure out what each of these organizations does and whether it reflects what you want to do. Another alternative is today to intern with organizations, with more non-partisan organizations, such as organizations like PRS, for example. There are also opportunities of that I think constantly, keep coming up, of interning with members of parliament. I think platforms like Network Capital, for example, are a great space to connect with people who are already in those offices. LinkedIn and Network Capital are your friends. Definitely use those. But when I was when I was entering policy, Network Capital was just in the stages of starting out. So yeah, like the world was different back then. But those are the sort of internships you can do. What I will say is that mostly any NGOs would also fall within the framework of public policy. Even something like a Teach for India would be in that framework. And so would working in the private sector at something like, for example, Dalberg or FSG or any organization that does that kind of work, that it like Samagra, for instance. There are also a lot of academic centers that do that kind of work, like the Carnegie Center, for instance, Ashoka University centers. And then, of course, you have your your own research initiatives that take place on your campus. So, for instance, CCG, for example, engages pretty strongly with tech policy in some ways, and I think there's a lot of room to maneuver. It's pretty broad. What I will say would be a disadvantage for somebody who wants to go into policy is doing strictly legal roles. Typically, your chances of getting into HKS are going to be significantly reduced if you have no experience in policy. So, for instance, if you go to a law firm and then you go into litigation and that's all you end up doing, you might have a chance at getting into HKS, but I would say it's not a strong one. And you might still end up getting into other schools for policy. Don't get me wrong on that. But For HK specifically, they do want to see some sort of dedication or passion for public service. It could be anything. I mean, for instance, one of the things that really stood out to me when I was, and I also helped out in my capacity as a lawyer, it was not really in my capacity as somebody in policy, but I worked with this initiative that was trying to lobby for changes to how forensic evidence is treated in the cases of sexual assault trials. And that, for instance, also had elements of policy in it, where we wanted to organize roundtables and get some, essentially get some conversation started about the kind of reform that's needed. So I think that's what a commitment to public service means. But like I said, you can be from any background. What you just need to ensure is that you are showing that you are passionate about the thing that you claim to be passionate about. I think it would be a little bit out of left field if you were an M&A lawyer who suddenly decided to go into policy without really having anything to show for it. So my point is just that be mindful of what is interesting to you and do those things. I think a lot of, and this is again without judgment, I think one defining factor of the law school experience is perception management. I think you should probably be less concerned about that and focus much more on just what it is that excites you. Trust me, over 5 years, you'll end up building a body of work that reflects exactly the kind of individual you are, especially if policy is what is interesting to you. And I recommend trying to have a healthy mix, especially if you're doing something like 2 internships a year. I recommend having a healthy mix of different types of work experiences. Not to disparage law firms or the conventional legal career as well. I think it's important to engage with different sorts of careers just so that you have a more composite understanding of the role policy would play. So I think that there's no right path to it. The only right path that I would say is, follow what excites you, because your story is going to your story is going to be told by your application and by your CV. They're not looking at who you worked with, they're looking at what you did. And I think that's something that a lot of people might end up losing out on, especially if they're trying to chase points on bullet points on CVs. I think the fundamental thing you want to acquire through any internship or learning experience is mentorship, exposure to new things that you've not done before, and the opportunity to get your hands dirty. I think it's great to have some sort of relationship with the output or the deliverable or the outcome. I think it's very important for you to see what your input ends up looking like. And I would say those are the sorts of things that actually contribute to building awareness about what it is that you would like to do, and also giving you a stronger sense of which way you'd like to engage in. Because some people may not like the think tank route. Some people might prefer to do it via private sector, or working with the ministry, for instance. So you have to, muddle through this and figure out your own path. But there's a lot happening, and I would recommend not looking down upon engaging with policy at a state level. So for instance, if you have the opportunity to work with your state government or your local government, I think that also is very favorably looked upon.
All right. So I think my next question is probably my last question with respect to the application process, and I want to talk to you more about the essays that you have to write, especially given that this year that's going to be one of the most important criterion for being selected at HKS. So can you tell us more about how you could possibly prepare for these, and also what does a good essay actually look like, right? Because this is something which is actually needed in almost every single master's application in the United States. So how do you think we could actually come up with a good essay, and what are the type of things we should try to focus on when we're writing it?
Sure. I'll just tackle the first part, how to prepare. So when it comes to applying for a master's, and this I believe is true for any master's program, irrespective of what requirements you might have to fulfill to be eligible, I do think you want to start planning this at least 6 months in advance, and that's honestly cutting it really fine. I do think that this is something that requires, in my opinion, 8 to 10 months, planning ahead. And if it's something you want to do, the first thing you should do is start having conversations with people that are doing the things that you admire. So for me, for instance, one of my turning points was when I spoke to this person who done an MPA ID from HKS, and he spoke in such glowing terms. And by the way, I do want to say this: when I was doing the LAMP fellowship, I knew what HKS was, but I had no idea what a master's in public policy entailed. I had no idea what these different types of degrees meant. And for me, international development was this vague thing that I couldn't really understand. Um, and it really helped me to have conversations not just with people from HKS, of course, but people who were in that space who were doing different sorts of things. Um, and I think the only way to prepare it is to really just talk to people and understand what they're doing. I think some LinkedIn stalking is in order as well. You may want to, do some term specific searches, like the school that you're looking for, the program that you're looking for, and maybe like try to cross reference that with their professions, like whether they're lawyers or not. Unfortunately or fortunately, um, you might not get so much good advice from somebody who is not from the same background as you. Although, of course, I would say the policy space ends up being a converging point for these different skill sets. Like, if you're an engineer or a lawyer, and you're in policy, you end up needing the same sort of skill sets. Don't get me wrong over there, but I think that it's important that you talk to people both from a legal background and a non-legal background to truly understand what a master's process, what a master's in public policy looks like, and what an application process looks like for each school. This is the kind of research that will, by the way, end up taking 1 to 2 months. So I really recommend starting on it. So for instance, typically deadlines are in December. So I would typically recommend starting on, exploring this in January, February, getting some conversations going in April or May, and starting the application process, around August or September. Especially if you're applying to multiple schools. I applied only to 2 schools, so I could really get away with starting my application process quite late. And I don't want to be any kind of a benchmark here, but I started my application process in October. But I even with 2 schools, I felt I was cutting it too fine when the deadlines actually arrived, because there's a lot that you need to do. And you end up, making multiple drafts of the same essay. I mean, I think I had something like 14 or 15 drafts for each of my essays, and that's that's a time consuming process. You want to be able to send it out for review as well, and it's not a it's not a cookie cutter sort of model. Like, every essay is very specific and unique to each individual. How you write it, what your story is, how you're telling that story. I think those are things that are very, very unique to you, and sometimes it takes a bit of practice to discover that authenticity. For me, for example, like, I think I finally hit my stride in the month of, like, in the end of November, like literally 2 weeks before the deadline is when I finally started writing like I could. um, like I finally started writing the way I thought I was best expressing myself. So one crucial thing that you no longer have to do, at least for this year, and perceivably for next year as well, is to take the GRE. Otherwise, if you do have to end up, and if you would like to do that, you will need at least a couple of months to prepare for the GRE. And given that we don't really have we're not in touch with our quantitative skills, it can be a bit of a challenge to shift suddenly back into solving mathematical problems, or GMAT, whatever exam it is that you end up taking. So give yourself 8 to 10 months so that you're not hurrying through it, because you want to be able to do it to your satisfaction. Now, coming to the second question, what does a successful essay look like? I don't think I want to answer it that way. I'd say, what does a successful application look like? A successful application is one that gives a composite picture of you as an individual. This is one piece of advice I offer to all applicants. Make sure that every single piece of information you're giving is complementary, not contradictory, and not repetitive. Because understand one thing: we are going through a lot of applications, and they and while they are absolutely fair and thorough in their processes, they also have a lot of fatigue, right? So what makes you stand out? And that's essential. That I will get to, especially because you can reflect that in your essays. But what makes you stand out is essentially your unique profile. So you want to be able to show yourself in the completeness of who you are. One thing I made it a point to do was, for instance, like in my analytical CV vis-a-vis my regular CV, I made it a point to have no repetition across the two. I also made it a point to, however small that experience might be, I made it a point to elaborate on everything that I'd done. I think one crucial thing that a lot of us might end up doing, especially if you suffer from imposter syndrome, is you might undersell the experience that you've had or downplay it. I think that you shouldn't be ashamed of what experiences you have. They are your experiences. You can't change them. Being ashamed of them is not going to make them go away. I think the thing to do is own everything that you've done and speak about it and try to demonstrate how that has contributed to your growth as an individual. So one thing I did in my CV, my general resume, sorry, which can be between 2 to 4 pages. I used up all 4 pages, and I made it a point to show who I was from, start to up, from like the starting of my professional life, so to speak, up till that point when I was applying. And one good thing to show in those CVs, and especially in the quant CV and the regular CV, is the impact of what you've done. So that could be the impact on you in some senses, but I think that's not the appropriate place to show it. In the two CVs, you want to show, okay, let me put it like this. In the quantitative CV, you want to show the impact that the quantitative stuff had, both on you and on the thing that you were doing. And in your resume, you want to show the impact you had on the organization or the um, committee or body of, whatever association you were part of. So for instance, I was, let me like give you an example. If you're on a journal for your at your university, you may want to, for example, speak about what you did for that journal. So for instance, if you end up being, chief editor of a journal, you may want to show that you released this issue, you set up this website, you set up these like these extra curricular activities like lectures, etc., or you set up what we called single credit courses. You might call them something else, but essentially extra credit courses. So I think that's what you want to be covering in your resume. Um, so with LOR specifically, you like, this is one thing that you don't really always have a lot of control over, in the sense that you might be able to educate your recommender about what exactly they are looking for when they're asking for a letter of recommendation. You should know that the school does give them some sort of basic structure, but it's still pretty rudimentary and it's pretty free flowing. You might want to impress upon your recommender that they want to stick to the word limit, and they want to demonstrate the qualities that you showed, um, but also not just show, like, write about what you are like as an individual, but also how those qualities translate into your professional self. So for instance, if they say that you're a good leader, they should be able to back it up with examples of leadership that you did, that you undertook at school. And I think that you want to get in touch with your recommenders at least 3 months ahead, because trust me, it's a grueling process, and that's a variable that you cannot control. That is entirely in their control. And sometimes, just getting them to submit it can run into a lot of roadblocks, especially with, things being remote as they are. You may not always be able to speed it up. So that's one aspect of it that is not in your control that I want you to be mindful of. And don't be shy to tell the person who's recommending you why you want to apply to the school, what you plan to do, what your goals are. One thing I did for all my recommenders was I gave them a very bare bones statement of why I wanted to do what I'm doing. And I also sent them my CV saying that this is my profile. You know what work I've done for you. And I also listed out some things that I'd done for them. And then I just said that, please feel free to reach out if you have any queries. Yeah, I didn't really have to, be too engaged in the drafting of it, luckily, just because of the fact that they were extremely responsive and because I'd given them the tools they needed to make those recommendations. Next, yes, when you're answering the questions on the application, it's very crucial that you've done your homework. Now, initially, I remember, if you recall, I said that it needs to be complementary, not contradictory. So if, for instance, in your essays and your LORs, etc., you're coming across as this person who's really interested, for instance, in international and global affairs and, international human rights, for instance, you don't want to suddenly be contradicting yourself in the application when you're filling it out by saying that, actually, I want to work at, for instance, the Business and Government Center. Or when you're highlighting, what your career aspirations might be, you don't want to then be saying things like, I actually want to go work at an Amazon and, be in their business development. I'm saying those goals are dynamic. So don't always believe that what you're saying in the essay is going to come true. No offense to anybody. Your goals change, information changes, and you should adapt to information changes. But my point is that be as authentic as you can in the essays and the applications. Do not lie, whatever you do. and make it a point that it reads complementarily. Just make sure that you are not saying something that contradicts the story that you are trying to paint about yourself as an individual. Yeah, and the last but not least, very important aspect, what does a good essay look like? Hmm. So I think this varies. But the fundamental things I found to be true about good essays are that there is clarity, not just in thought, but also in expression. There's simplicity, which means that you're not going into these pedantic rumblings and, going on and on in poetic or rhetorical language. You want to be able to put across your idea as clearly and as efficiently as possible. Um, they do want you to do a little bit of humble bragging, and that's okay. Like, don't feel inhibited, about praising yourself for the things that you've done. They do like a clear identification of the work that you've done, how it's impacted you as an individual, and they like to understand your underlying motivation. So I think that, for instance, if your CV is saying that you've done the LAMP Fellowship, right? You don't want to be talking about what you did at the LAMP as much as what you got out of the LAMP. So for instance, what you did in the LAMP Fellowship would come in your CV, right? Like, I drafted this many bills, I did this, I did that. But you want your essay to reflect the lesson that you learned while you were doing that. So for instance, when I was doing the LAMP Fellowship, I did some drafting for private member bills. I did some drafting for private member bills that my MP was in charge of, and that he wanted to present. And I learned a lot about drafting through that process. It was the first time in my life I was drafting a legislation, like a full legislation, and you end up learning a lot. It was a very humbling process also, because I realized that, you do need to take help even from people who may not necessarily be lawyers, but people who might understand certain nuances more than you do. So that was, for instance, one of the lessons that I took a lot of care to input in my essay. So aside from that, aside from showing what you've learned, you also want to show what your vision for your future is. And this is extremely important. You want to be able to show what you want to do while you're at HKS, and that entails a significant amount of research. You want to be able to show what you plan to do after HKS. You want to be able to show what you plan to do with your life. And I would broadly categorize this into, immediate term, medium term, and long term. Immediate term is, what you want to do while you're at HKS, what internships you want to do, what you want to do immediately after. Medium term is typically, how do you plan to step into your path towards your long term goals. So for instance, if you want to be a politician, right, how do you plan to get there from where you are right now? I think it's good to chart out that plan. Coming back to what I said about showing that you've done your research, especially on HKS, I think that it's important that you show that you understand why you want to go there. Like, your reason should not be that it's HKS and that it's the Harvard brand name. Your reason should really go deeper than that, and it should show that these are the courses that excite me. These are the professors that excite me. This is what excites me about it. And don't say the stock stuff that you're looking forward to being part of an international community, or you're looking forward to like banking on the alumni network to get a good job. I think you want to talk about the stuff that truly calls out to you, the stuff that truly excites you, and maybe the stuff that moves you along towards your long-term goal. Because it's never too early to start planning for that, at least as far as each case's selection committee is concerned. A couple of things that I want to highlight before I wrap this one up. I think that you should know that your transcript doesn't really matter. Unlike LLMs, where a lot of store is set by your undergraduate marks, your transcript won't make a big difference to your chances of getting accepted at HKS, because they really do believe in diversity. They don't believe that there's any one way to judge an individual. I think that one great thing about HKS, and generally about, I think, policy schools in the US, is that there is a place for everyone. You could be any sort of student. You could be someone who struggled with, grades or mental health or any number of issues. And, they still acknowledge that you are an individual worthy of getting a chance. So my point here is just that while transcripts are extremely important in LLM applications, they are not half as important in an MPP application. What I will say is that if there is a chance for you to explain something that you want the committee to know. Like there's typically that question, and I believe that I've seen that in all the applications that I did, in all two of the applications that I did. But they did give me an opportunity, gave me a small box with, like, I think 200 characters, saying that if there's something that you want the committee to know, here's your opportunity. Feel free to talk about it. So, for instance, I before I went to NLS Bangalore, I also spent a year in LSR in Delhi University, and there was this like gap in my CV, this missing year, and I wanted to clarify what it was. So I said very specifically that this is what happened, but I was pretty sure I wanted to be a lawyer, so I took the exam again, and made sure to make that particular gambit a success. Um, the final thought on what a successful application looks like that I want to leave you with is, um, you do want to talk to people who are also current students at HKS, just because they will give you a pretty realistic assessment of how things are at that moment. But remember one thing: like each person's experience is what you make it. So don't temper yourself with don't try to temper what you're saying or what you're writing with realistic expectations. Be as ambitious as you can, and talk about who you would be and what you would do if you were in an ideal world, and if money and other constraints were no object. I think that's what you really want to do. Present yourself as the person who has maximized their potential when you're speaking about your long-term goals. And however unrealistic it might seem, you do want to be emphasizing that particular side of you, that if I come to HKS here, this is the person I could become. And that's what I think they are finally trying to understand, not just who you are and where you're coming from, but who they will be molding you into and how you will be contributing to their community and their alumni network. And I think that's the composite that I was speaking about.
I think that was a very, very informative answer, and I think that really helps out when people are trying to make apps now. I think moving to the last part of career prospects and opportunities post an MPP. I think the first place where I want to just start is I just want to understand, do you think that, like, what do you think is the difference in terms of opportunities that a law graduate, let's say post a 5-year LLB degree in India, has compared to a person who's actually done an MPP at HKS2?
I think one big thing is credibility. It, any kind of master's degree will give you more credibility in that field. But most importantly, I think one thing that opens up to you is careers that are not typically legal. And this is not just, by the way, in India. Like a lot of my friends who are Indians are doing things that they weren't doing in India. Like I have friends that went into the private sector. I have friends that went into banks, and I have friends that who didn't even know that they were going to end up in something like a World Bank, and it sort of developed over time for them. I think the world, to copy the cliche, I think the world really is your oyster once you've done an MPP. And to put it as bluntly as possible, the Harvard name does not hurt at all. Like, it makes a world of a difference even in India, right? What sets Harvard apart from any other brand in that sense is that it has international, global recognition. Um, and it makes a pretty big difference just having that kind of name, that kind of alumni network to fall back on. The alumni network of not just HKS but generally Harvard is really huge. And for instance, you end up becoming a member of something like the Harvard Club of India, which is replete with these different illustrious people who've done different programs at in the Harvard ecosystem, and they're all people that you can gain some sort of value from. And here I'm not talking about necessarily gaining opportunities, but also simply gaining mentorship, or gaining a role model. I think that's also useful in itself. One thing I will say, that somebody who has a 5-year BA LLB who goes straight into, say, for instance, HKS, does not have is exposure. When I was at HKS, and this is something I really liked about it, you're not just interacting with other MPPs, you're interacting with the whole school, you're interacting with faculty, you're interacting with people from other schools, and cross registration is a big thing. So that's essentially people from other schools registering at HKS, and you can also register at those schools. You interact with people from all walks of life and all sorts of fields. Some of my closest friends are doing their PhDs at Harvard. at the faculty of, at the grad school for arts and sciences. And I think that that's something that you just won't have coming from India. I got to learn about a lot of different types of professions. I shed a lot of judgment. I got rid of a lot of judgment about, certain kinds of professions. I think that I learned to open my mind. And I definitely learned to confront both my strengths and weaknesses and not be afraid of my failings. I think one great thing about Harvard is that it makes you a more well-rounded individual, and it makes you somebody who's a lot more responsible to the things that you want to do. Going in, I know it may not seem like that, but I had a phase in law school where I was a little lackluster about, academics and extracurriculars, and I had lost a lot of motivation, so to speak. And going to HKS, coming out from HKS, I came out with so much motivation and so much more belief in myself. And I think those are intangibles that aren't really easy to quantify, but they end up having long-term payoffs. And like I said, in terms of opportunities, the world is your oyster. I will say one thing, and I think this is probably more for once you're already there. Like I said earlier, your experience is what you make of it. A lot of work opportunities. It may not necessarily be the case in India, but it is the case in the US at least, and in all these international government IGOs and banks, that networking makes a pretty big difference. So you do need to make a case for yourself, right? You do need to be able to market yourself as your brand and as your product. And I think that is one of the, not one of the roadblocks, but I'd say that not doing that is one of the roadblocks to opportunities. The other thing I'll say that as a lawyer, you might need to overcome a little bit is that bias against lawyers in some senses, especially in fields that lawyers may not typically be in, right? So for instance, when I was applying to the World Bank, I kept getting referred to these World Bank internships that were with the legal department or the legal vice presidency unit. And don't get me wrong, like that's super interesting stuff as well for someone who likes that kind of stuff. But I really wanted to do, at that time, I was more interested in governance and good governance. And that's what I wanted to do. And it took a lot of, lobbying for myself to get that kind of opportunity. So I think that's one barrier that exists for lawyers because, you're immediately typecast into somebody who's detail oriented, who's good at arguing, who's good at, I don't know, analyzing arguments from both sides, but who may not be very good for something that requires more quantitative skills. My point is that you can overcome all of that. By the way, you have all those tools. You can become as good at quant as you want. You can become as good at coding as you want because there's a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of mentorship. And like I said, you can register at any school. And I, for example, found a lot of mentorship in a professor who used to teach computer science, who taught us this one course at HKS and who ended up being a really, really strong influence over my career choices. So my point is just that, you have to figure out what you want to make of it. And going in, just know what you want out of it and don't lose conviction. Those are the primary things I'd say are important. And, once you have the Harvard name, anything's possible. Like you reach out to people, you reach out to your alumni network, you will get a response. You just will. And, that's something that I would say that I think we have seen a significant advantage is being from, such prestigious national law schools. Just imagine that magnified globally. So that's what I would say is the fundamental difference.
Thanks for that very interesting answer. I think I'm just going to go to my last question, as I think we've already shot this for very long. I don't want to keep you for too long. So could you just talk to us about the scope or opportunities that are actually available with respect to public policy careers in India? Because this is a very, very, very big myth that you see with a lot of law students, that there aren't too many opportunities with public policy in India. Let's just say in terms of opportunities available, or also in terms of the kind of paychecks that you would be getting in those kind of jobs, and so on. So anything you would want to say on that front?
Yeah, I think that okay, it's a little true that paychecks don't necessarily reflect the kind of effort that you might need to put in. But I think that's also changing, like a lot of nonprofits today recognize that the pay scales that they were following aren't so good. But in terms of opportunities, where is it that you can't work with a policy degree? So you can go to a nonprofit, you can be attached to the government. The government is constantly trying to engage with younger people these days. You can work at something like a Niti Aayog. You can go to companies that today have a lot of government engagement as well, corporate, external, and legal affairs teams, for instance. You can also go to law firms that are trying to branch out and diversify into this. You can go into boutique organizations such as organizations that focus on lobbying. There's pretty much anything that you can do. But yes, like I said, a lot of that could be met with some bias if you don't have a lot of experience in India to begin with. I think that the field of policy is pretty broad in the sense that you can do anything that you want to do. But remember that even in India, policy is a little networking heavy in the sense that people do want to be able to put a face to the name. It's not as identity neutral, so to speak, as working at a law firm would be. So your politics matters, your visibility matters, and a lot of times people end up becoming independent consultants as well. Like I know so many people, like for instance, just to quote one HKS alum that who I mentioned I met during my LAMP fellowship is the founder of the Quantum Hub, for instance, and they organize YLAC, which is this program through which they encourage young people to engage with policy in India. I think that it's a growing space. I think a lot of private sector companies are also trying to diversify. It's not just the tech companies that have public policy focuses or public policy teams. You do see a lot of that sort of engagement coming up even in companies like HUL or Coca-Cola or any of the big companies that are not tech companies. So I think that those opportunities all exist, but you do need some credibility aside from just going to a university that gives you those skills. That credibility comes from networking, from establishing a virtual presence, from maybe publications. It's a lot of things, and also your internships do end up having some sort of impact. So you should use the time that you have at HKS, for instance, to work with academic centers, work with different organizations, work with different professors, and try to understand the opportunities that you would be best suited for. Fortunately or unfortunately, things are as they are in terms of pay scales in India. I don't necessarily see that changing at a rapid scale, but it's not all bad. Like you have some think tanks that are looking to pay more. For instance, I know that Vidhi and IDFC, which is in Mumbai, are pretty competitive in their pay scales. So I would say that it's a growing field, but you can do a lot of things that you choose to do. I think the only thing that you want to keep in mind is that it's a young field and it's growing. And it has a place for everyone. Like you could be doing lobbying, you could be doing pure policy, you could be doing academic work, you could be doing something like a JPAL, you could go to a World Bank India office, you could do something with the UN, you could do something with the government, you could do something with quasi-governmental organizations. There's a lot of room for things that for opportunities that you want to access. I don't know if that answers the question, but honestly, like you just need to do a bit of like LinkedIn searching or Google searching, and you'll realize that organizations are changing their priorities to reflect these sorts of needs. And even within policy, there are more specific roles, right? For instance, there's sustainability, there's privacy, there's trust and safety, there's government engagement, there's external affairs, which is essentially, perception management, but from a policy and legal perspective. So it's a pretty vast field like that.
All right, thank you so much for that. I think I'm done with my set of questions. So if there's any general tips or comments that you would want to make, then please.
Sure. I think, and I'm also a little tired of speaking so much, but I will say that you should just try to explore what calls to you. I think one thing I did right in law school was not limiting my curiosity in the sense that I worked with a judge, I did litigation internships, I did firm internships, I did NGO internships. I mean, I even worked with the Times of India in my first year. So just to preface that with like opportunity costs in terms of time, try to do everything that you can that makes you feel curious. Try to reach out to people that are doing things that excite you. Try to follow people that might be exciting, whose like lives or profiles might be exciting to you. So for instance, if you for instance find the the founder of the Ken really inspiring, you might want to trace his profile, see how he rose to that kind of prominence. um I think it's important to try to like look for role models. They don't always appear, but don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for advice. Nobody ever looked stupid just because they didn't really know something from the beginning. You're not born knowing everything, and I think it's important that, especially if you want to learn something, it's important to acknowledge that you know nothing about it and go in with humility, but go in with an attitude where you are looking to learn. You're not looking to prove yourself as someone who knows everything. You're looking to grow as an individual. And I think that humility is extremely important when you are, pivoting into a field that is not a conventional career for lawyers.
All right, thank you so much. So, Shimal, I just want to thank you again on behalf of Plant for actually taking out the time to come for this session. It was really, really informative. And on behalf of Team Plant, I would just want to thank you once again. I think I can